I'm in Biel in northern Switzerland, where I'm working as part of the team for the Biel Chess Festival. It's a fantastic event, lots of different tournaments, and at the top is the Biel Grandmaster tournament, featuring 6 players playing a double round all play all. If you haven't checked out my preview video, then please do so, just click on the link. But of course the star of the show is Magnus Carlsen, and in round 1 he faced David Navara from the Czech Republic. Now they actually have an even score. They've played 7 games and it's 50%, 5 draws and a win apiece for the players. So not an easy opponent for Magnus. In fact, they played in Shamkir earlier in the year, and Magnus also had white in that game. It was a Caro-Kann, and Magnus really got nothing out of that opening at all. Well, in yesterday's game, they played a Ragozin, and this is pretty standard theory. Magnus has had this position with both white and black. So white has got rid of his dark-squared bishop, and that's given him time to bring the rook to c1 in an active position. But giving up the bishops, well, that can be a problem sometimes. Black's main problem here is actually how to bring that bishop on c8 into the game. And here castles has been played before, but Carlsen decides to take on c5. And he's had this position with black against Giri, for example, in Shamkir in 2015. And Giri went c6, but after knight e5, whoops, I beg your pardon, c6, knight e5, in fact, black has no difficulties at all. But Carlsen played castles kingside, a very natural move. And black is very close to completing his development. So if, for example, white makes a natural move like queen e2, wanting to bring the king's rook into the game, then black could take here and just play b6. And once the bishop comes to the long diagonal, then black has no difficulties whatsoever. I would even start to prefer black's position to white there. So, well, Carlsen plays a very typical move for him. A move that just sets his opponent a few problems. So he removes that knight from where it can be taken by the bishop. And suddenly that bishop on b4 looks a little bit stranded, because white, well, has a kind of threat to play a3 and b4. But black also has the problem of how he's going to complete his development with that bishop on c8, blocking the 2 rooks. So a6 played, just expelling that knight, came back into the middle. This position has actually been reached before. I'm not sure that Magnus knew that. After the game he said that he hadn't really expected this opening. And during the game, I had the impression that he was kind of just feeling his way through this. He wasn't exactly sure what he was doing, but he's certainly setting black some problems here. As I said, it has been played before. Here, a game between Salem from the United Arab Emirates and Peralta went bishop a5, and certainly white had some initiative in this game. You can see that, well, white pieces are coming out very easily. White has some initiative, but black still has the problem of what to do about this bishop here. So a slightly tricky position for black, but Navara played here in a very straightforward way. b5, attacking the bishop. That bishop dropped back, and then e5. Now this is an attempt to solve all black's problems straight away. White even has to be a little bit careful here. So for example, after knight b3, then rook d8 attacks the queen, and when the queen comes up, then bishop f5, and suddenly that queen is in trouble. during the game I thought that Carlsen would just play a3 here, but well, it doesn't really give white anything at all after this, and rook d8. Really, black is going to take here, and black shouldn't have any difficulties here at all, gets his pawn back. So Carlsen thought for some time here, and he came up with a really interesting solution. He played knight back, attacking the bishop. So if the bishop drops to a5, then we can win a piece. But instead of that, rook d8 leaves the queen very embarrassed, but this was Carlsen's intention. He gave up his queen. This is such a brave decision. So he has a rook and a knight for the queen. And at the moment, even pawns, but white has some initiative here. You can see the knight is attacked. Black isn't fully developed yet. And this knight is about to hop into d5, that beautiful central square. So white is beautifully developed, really harmonious position. So can black withstand this initiative? Well, first of all, what do we do about the knight? You could drop it back to d7, looks a bit passive. Could defend it with the queen from here, but this shows how dangerous white's initiative is, and suddenly those knights look really menacing and black's pieces are really sidelined here. Navara, I think, defended or counterattacked excellently here. He played a5, so meeting a threat with a threat. So if rook takes knight, pawn takes, and that automatically brings the rook into the game. It doesn't matter that these pawns are dropping. Black's pieces are really actively placed now, beautifully coordinated, and well, I think all we can say is black certainly isn't worse here. White has to be a little bit careful. So Carlsen instead put the knight into the middle of the board, attacking the queen, and rook takes knight threatened. So the queen comes across to defend the knight, which looks a bit awkward, but in fact the knight has no decent discovered attack because all those squares are covered by the queen. Now if white wants a draw, then you could bring the knight back to c3, attacking the queen, and the queen goes back, and then knight d5, queen d6, etc. We've repeated the position, but no, Carlsen wants more. He played knight takes pawn in the middle, and this starts to get interesting. I mean, it's already turning into a real mess. Let me show you one fantastic variation. Black can take this knight, then rook takes knight, and now queen takes b2. Now the best move in this position is bishop f3, and this actually presents black with a few problems. Black is probably okay if he plays accurately, but instead of bishop f3, there's a trap. White can play knight e7 check, and the idea, of course, is just to take this bishop here. So, for example, if king here, then knight takes, and black does not have time to take the bishop because of rook d8 checkmate. But black has an incredible defense here. First of all, king into the corner, so that if knight takes bishop, we can take here. So then white plays rook d8, check, the king steps up, and now bishop check. So that means that black can no longer take that bishop. And after, for example, g6, then we take here, so white has one material, and it's no problem after queen a1 check, the bishop drops to cover the king, and white should be winning that position. But after bishop d3 check, black has an unbelievable resource. He can play bishop f5, an extraordinary move. Now, if this is captured, well, let's say by a knight, then we can give a check, and we take the rook here. So let's go back. The question is, what happens on bishop takes bishop check, but then comes g6. Now the bishop is being dragged away from this diagonal, so that after rook takes rook, then we can give a check and mate in a couple of moves. So after this, well, the rook can come back to defend the back rank, but then pawn takes bishop, and this is very good for black. The rook is now perfectly placed behind that passed pawn. Black should be better there. So an unbelievable resource, bishop f5. That's the main variation. Let me just show you one other variation which is pretty incredible. After rook takes rook, check, bishop here. Now you might think that white has a slight chance here, but in this position bishop e4 attacks the rook and threatens mate on g2. This is very typical when you have a queen against, well, minor pieces or rook and minor pieces, that sometimes it's very difficult to coordinate all those pieces together, and the queen is just like a guided missile hitting those targets beautifully. Okay, back we come. That was a long digression, but I just thought bishop f5 is such a beautiful move, I had to show it. Okay, so here we go. Bishop b7 played instead of taking the knight. Far more sensible. So he's completing his development. Here Carlsen said afterwards he was kind of kicking himself. He thought that that f4 supporting the knight would be a stronger move. Well, perhaps. I also think it's a risky move because it does open up the king to some extent. In fact, black is still absolutely fine after rook c8, and there's the possibility to come into a4. So although, yeah, he regretted afterwards playing bishop f3, somehow I think it's a more prudent move than f4 actually. But it just shows his desire to get the maximum out of the position. So bishop f3, rook c8, protecting the knight, and now threatening to take this one here. So the knight had to move, but this is an awkward position for the knight. In some ways, it's no wonder that Carlsen said afterwards that he wanted to play f4, because his knight is driven to a poor square. Now, sorry, let me just go back one move. Of course, after this move, knight g4, there is a threat to play knight f6 to win the queen. So the queen drops back. But now this knight is awkwardly placed, and Carlsen has to play this in order to give his knight an escape square on h2. But the exchange of rooks has really benefited black, and it means that, well, it's classic strategy in these kind of situations to exchange off a pair of rooks. It means that white has more problems in keeping all his pieces together. Those rooks are very strong when they're connected and protecting each other, but when there's only one of them on the board, then white has to take more care. At the moment you can see all those pieces are protected, but it doesn't take long for black to find some targets in this position, and you can see that knight is poorly placed on h2. So now Navara has found his feet. He's given up one pawn, but, well, he gives up another now, but he has beautiful coordination now, and those minor pieces looking very well placed indeed. And now it's the turn for the queen to come into the game. So you can see that white's pieces have had to fall back, and now this queen is, yeah, it's guided missile time. So it's looking at these targets across the board, and of course any minor piece that's unprotected, it'll be straight in there. So this is a dangerous position, more dangerous for white than black actually. I mean, I think objectively it's about equal. So the queen attacks here, and of course if g3, this looks very dubious with all these weakened light squares, and this queen can perhaps get in there as well. So instead of that, Carlsen played rook d4 to protect that. And now the queen edges up again, looking down here. The knight improves its situation. Now queen b3, attacking the pawn, so the rook has to fall back. So you can see that black has some initiative here. Both players, well, not in huge time pressure. Carlsen had about 20 minutes here. Navara was ticking down towards 5 minutes. Maybe it was maybe 15 minutes and 5 minutes, but slight time pressure for Navara, so he had to be careful. But he played very well. Knight c4, excellent move. And here I was anticipating that the game would actually peter out to a draw after bishop takes and then rook d4, attacking the queen, and then the queen comes back to b3 and then rook d2 and so on. After queen c4, I don't think white can avoid the draw. But remarkably, Magnus actually wanted to get more from this position. And he played a really daring move. He played rook d7. This is so typical of him. He wants to squeeze the maximum out of the position. But this is very, very risky, because you can see that white's pieces are leaving their comfort zone, leaving security. So watch what happens. Knight takes pawn, rook takes, queen takes, so that's a sort of forcing variation. And queen and knight can be a really potent attacking combination, and also this pawn is loose. But Carlsen is looking to the other side of the board. It's very double-edged. So here it's possible for black to play queen takes pawn. And this is a really wild situation. After this, now the king steps up, a rook check, and then bishop takes pawn. Well, this is an absolutely wild position. Maybe Navara just thought, okay, I can't really cope with this in time pressure. But this position could go any way. All three results are possible. But Navara played more calmly, actually. He played king f8. He just kept things under control, because after this he found a good move. Now, not queen takes pawn, because this is a much worse situation because the king is on the back rank. So after this, and knight g3 and the knight coming to f5, then suddenly the king is in a mating net. But queen c6, excellent move. So the queen just disturbs the rook. If rook a7, keeping hold of the bishop, then the knight hops in here. There's a chance to attack the f2 pawn with the queen and knight. Sometimes knight e1 can also be very strong. Suddenly black has the initiative, and this is where we can see that the disparate forces of white just can't coordinate very well at all. So Carlsen compromises and takes the knight. Now he has a problem. If he loses that pawn, then it's over. So he has to bring the rook to d4. Navara takes the chance to attack two pawns and win one of them back. So Carlsen defends that with rook d3. The h-pawn is gone, but now that gives Carlsen a chance to, well, lock down the queen side, so he has total security here. The rook defends the pawn here defends the rook, and, well, Carlsen said afterwards he was expecting the score sheets to be signed very soon. Basically, if black just sits here, there's not a lot that white can do, because if that rook moves away, obviously the a-pawn is vulnerable. If white starts to push the e-pawn, then the rook loses its support, so that's too dangerous. So basically it should be a draw. But instead, Navara played something extraordinary here. He started to advance his kingside pawns. Now, I think, well, at the time I was commentating on this game, and, well, I couldn't believe that he played like this. We were really, really surprised. And it really is risky. The thing is, White's moves here are fairly easy to play. Basically, first task is just to maneuver the knight to a better position. White has complete security, the rook holds everything, and the task is just to spin round to attack that pawn. Navara basically had calculated a long variation which he thought was satisfactory for him, but he'd missed one move right at the end of a long variation, and that can be typical for him. He's a brilliant calculator and likes to calculate variations, but sometimes he loses the big picture. Here he'd looked at Queen F1 and thought this was a draw, but he'd forgotten that this knight basically isn't trapped at the side of the board and can simply hop back into F6. A check on H3 doesn't do black any good at all. So basically he's lost one of the pawns, and now White has to just maneuver around to win that G pawn. So it went like this. And the thing is, a typical Magnus position, basically he can spin that knight round and take his time and get his pieces in exactly the right position. Now, it's quite possible that Navara could have defended this position a little better, but I think in practice this is really tough. For example, Queen C6 keeps a hold of that A pawn for the time being, but Queen D3 was a mistake, and now the pawn advances, and one possibility, for example, is to bring the knight to E3 to take that third pawn on the king side. Well, another pawn on the king side anyway. And here this position is basically just lost. Let's just go through the final moves. The queen and king are very awkwardly placed, so that now, as well as threats to the G pawn, well, there are now threats to king and queen as well. And in this position, Rook F5 was a decisive move. If the king goes back, then Rook F6 check wins the queen. So Navara had to transpose into the king and pawn endgame, which is lost. And here's another a clever little move from Carlsen. Of course, this has to be taken, and we transpose into a simple king and pawn endgame, which is winning. And now G4 would be a mistake, but it's important that White's king dives straight away towards the A pawn, and here Navara resigned because Black's king is just one tempo too slow. Let me just show you what happens. So here, and White's king moves across and gets to the key square on B6 to block out the king, and then the A pawn goes through. Well, I thought this was a fantastic game up to round about the time control, move 40. But there, Navara just lost the plot by advancing his kingside pawns. But I have to say, a really brave game by Carlsen, who just extracted the absolute maximum out of this position and kept creating not exactly winning chances, but creating enough tension in the position to keep the game going. Typical Carlsen. Well, fantastic start to the Biel Grandmaster tournament. There was another decisive game. Shahriar Mamedyarov beat Nico Georgiadis, and Svidler and Vasilyev made a draw. So do join me for round 2. More videos coming your way.